thank you so much for inviting me tonight. This is especially nice for me because I love the opportunity to talk to an audience who actually appreciates the value of our history, of our country, and specifically the Civil War. And you guys really are stewards of this part of our history. So I have tremendous appreciation and respect for that. So this is like exceptionally nice for me. Now, I'm actually a filmmaker, and I was working on, as I still am, a 4-part series about Civil War medicine when I received an offer a couple years ago to write a book about the subject. It wasn't something I had intended to do, but I had done years of research with primary source materials, letters, memorabilia, publications, diaries, periodicals from the area. I only worked with original period materials. Now, when we hear the word Civil War medicine, and I realize you guys are probably pretty sophisticated with this, and you may already know some of the things I'm going to talk about, but I hope you'll find some new things or that you'll enjoy revisiting. When we hear Civil War medicine, to most people, it conjures up images of assembly line surgeries, amputations, bone saws, horrible suffering, surgeries done in the open, and Civil War medicine is all of those things. But in the course of my research, it turned out to have been a far more broad-reaching and revolutionary topic than I had ever expected. And from the perspective of the changes and innovations that were made during this period, America really revolutionized Western medicine. We're going to talk about that. It was clinically, institutionally, administrative, and organizationally. Everything changed so radically because of Civil War medicine, really. But the story also turned out to be one of incredible heroism, of the American character revealed as courageous, compassionate, and not giving up. It was really a remarkable story about extraordinary people. I wrote a lot about them, and it was a fantastic opportunity to be able to dig deeper. It was a situation of incredible wounds and sickness and terrible things with people, even the professionals who had no training in trauma medicine. So it was seemingly unending horror and violence for 4 years. Well, let's jump right in. You know this guy, Old Baldy. I was particularly happy about your mascot or reason for working together because I'm an animal lover. And the story of Old Baldy was pretty impressive. This horse was wounded 14 times. I could not believe that they got him to go back into battle. But he outlived General Meade, his owner, by 10 years. He passed away at the age of 30 in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. And he really is, to me, symbolic of the more than 3 million horses and mules who served in the Civil War, and at least half of them lost their lives. I want to talk about another million, and this was the million human casualties that were a result of this conflict. I'm going to take you on a crash course through the causes of these casualties. And the first one really is the rapid advances in the technology of weapons. Now, when the Civil War started, the most popular gun in America was the Springfield smoothbore musket. This gun had been around for a long time. So, and it was rather classically beautiful. There were soldiers who wrote poems to their Springfields. It was beautifully designed and executed. They liked the polished metal. They loved the polished wood. So this musket, though, fired a musket ball. This was like a fat marble made out of lead or sometimes stone. They wrapped it in a piece of fabric before inserting it into the barrel of the gun with a long tool called a ramrod. And the fabric was to keep it from bouncing around on its exit. from that barrel. Remember that these technological changes are taking place in a space of only about 3 years, really. So here's the musket ball, but it gets superseded by a bullet-shaped ammunition, also known as a ball, the mini ball. It was invented by a French army officer, Claude Etienne Mini, and this thing changed a lot. The smoothbore muskets could fire basically 1 round a minute. If you were really good, maybe you could get a second round in there, but pretty much 1 round. Well, when this new ammunition came into use, they began to cut grooves inside those formerly smooth barrels of the gun. And the grooves that you see at the bottom of the mini ball locked in with those. Well, so it kept the ammunition far more stable on its exit from the gun. It increased the speed, the trajectory, and the effectiveness of this weapon. Here is a very popular, the Springfield model 1861. So this gun could really fire about 3 rounds a minute. It was pretty efficient. Now, things got even more intense when Christopher Minor Spencer from Connecticut developed his repeating rifle, which was the first really reliable repeating gun. Now we are getting into the ancestry of all assault rifles. These developments created the technology that we fear today. Now, the one you see at the top is a carbine. It has a shorter barrel that was designed for use by the cavalry when having that very long shoulder gun could be awkward. The repeating rifles could fire 20 rounds a minute. So we went in a short period of time from 1 round a minute to 3 to 20 rounds a minute. And that is when the monster came into being, the Gatling gun. The Gatling gun had 6 separate rifle barrels attached to a metal cylinder that was cranked by hand. As you can see, it was pretty easy to move around, and it could fire 200 rounds a minute. So we went in just a couple years from 1 round to 3 to 20 rounds a minute to 200 rounds a minute. It completely changed the face of battle and of warfare. The astonishing thing about this terrible, effective weapon was that it was invented by a medical doctor. This is Richard Jordan Gatling, Dr. Richard Gatling. He was a very gifted inventor. He had made a small fortune creating devices to aid in agriculture for planting crops. He did very well. And unfortunately, on a business trip in his late 20s, he contracted smallpox. Well, he was one of the fortunate ones who recovered. And when he did, he decided that he really wanted to go to medical school. He attended medical school in Ohio. He earned his MD degree, and he saw the horror of the young men returning from the war, horribly wounded, wickedly sick, and he explained after the war why he had invented this horrific weapon. He said, "It occurred to me that if I could invent a machine, a gun, which could, by rapidity of fire, enable 1 man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would, to a great extent, supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently exposure to battle and disease be greatly diminished." He thought he was going to end war with it. Well, the other side of what was taking out all these soldiers were diseases. Pneumonia, typhoid, diarrhea, and dysentery killed thousands of men. Malaria haunted them. It came back, it left people senseless, insensible for weeks sometimes. The diseases we know as childhood diseases, measles and chicken pox, killed so many people. And it was usually guys who grew up in the country and hadn't been exposed to large crowds of people in cities who were extremely susceptible to these. Yellow fever and rheumatic fever spread through the troops. So what did they have to deal with it? Well, it was pretty limited. They had quinine and they had opium, basically. Now, quinine had been in use. It was used for people, it was used for horses, and it was a fairly effective pharmaceutical. It was something that was extant in South America for many years. It's made from the bark of the cinchona tree, and it's thought that it made its way to North America with the Jesuits. Sometimes it's called Jesuit bark or Cardinal's bark. Quinine really was of immense value to the people who fought the Civil War, or who medically fought the Civil War. And opium was widely available. It was in virtually every over-the-counter pharmaceutical, and it led to what was known as old soldiers' disease, with terrible addiction problems after the war. Now, they had anesthesia. I know there is a lot of misinformation out there that they didn't, but they did. They had ether and chloroform, which interestingly were brought to surgery by dentists. Dentists had discovered the properties of anesthesia in the 1840s, and they brought it to the physicians. Now, they both of these drugs had drawbacks. They were effective in being able to keep a patient unconscious for the 9-minute window they needed to do an amputation, the most popular life-saving surgery. But ether, it was incredibly flammable, and these are people doing surgery in wooden and fabric tents by candlelight, so you can imagine. And chloroform has a very effective and not as flammable as ether by any means, but it had the unfortunate side effects that it can kill in an instant unexpectedly. Now, it is thought that it was inhaling it that somehow froze the heart and lungs, but they had the occasional just sudden death from the use of chloroform. Well, the battles were intense. And this is the first big battle, the first Battle of Bull Run in 1861, where there were more than 3,000 Union casualties and more than 2,000 Confederate casualties. Some of those casualties lay wounded on that field for a full week. There was no ambulance service in America. This was a really desperate kind of situation, and no hospitals. So they began to extemporize buildings, private homes, public buildings, government buildings, and churches were extemporized frequently as hospitals. Now you can see here what they would do basically is come in and put boards over the pews. So they created a second floor. Then they moved in the beds and hundreds of wounded. They also did use private homes and barns. This one is extraordinary. The Roberts Hospital in Richmond, Virginia. It was extraordinary for a couple of reasons. This was owned by Judge Roberts, a circuit court judge in Richmond, who moved his family into the country to get them out of the front row of the war. And he had a friend from his church, Sally Tompkins, who had, after losing most of her family to illness, devoted her life and her small fortune to philanthropy. Well, Judge Roberts let Sally take over the use of his house on Main Street as a hospital, which she did. She roped in a bunch of other ladies from the church. They remade it as a hospital. It had 22 beds. It was scrupulously clean. They served meals and medications on a schedule. She had one of the lowest death rates in the Confederacy. And it was extraordinary for another reason. This young woman became the first woman ever commissioned by the Confederate Army. What was happening was the military was running a bunch of the hospitals, and volunteers had set up a bunch, but they were getting concerned about theft, pilferage, disorganization. And so the Confederate Army outlawed all hospitals except those run by the military. But they wanted to keep Sally's Roberts Hospital going because it was just incredibly good. And it was said that wounded soldiers begged to be sent to her hospital. So how they got around that was they commissioned her as a captain in the Confederate Army the first time a woman had ever been in that position, and they kept her hospital open throughout the war as a military facility. So when you look at this picture, what you really are looking at is the waiting room for the surgical suite. It really gives you an idea. I mean, this is such a small percentage of the people who were going to need these life-saving surgeries. And this is what it looked like all over the country after a battle, hundreds of people waiting for help. And most of the hospitals at this point were tents. This was a large general hospital. This is how they functioned. I mean, this is pretty far along in the arrangements. So the patients were kept in tents. The surgery was performed in tents. Again, candlelight. It was a pretty difficult situation. But so many government buildings were called into service, and including the rotunda of the United States Capitol, which served briefly as a hospital. This is a painting actually from inside the Capitol. It's by Alan Cox, and it's probably a pretty accurate depiction of how things were set up in the rotunda. And interesting, well, they had to feed all these people. So the Capitol really was a multi-purpose building at that point, and they built a bakery in the basement. It is estimated that during the few years that the bakery in the Capitol was operational, that it created 5 million loaves of bread. Now, there was another group in the Capitol. The Library of Congress was housed there originally, and they were pretty upset about the bakery, worrying that the smoke was affecting the books. So they were highly relieved when the bakery finally closed. The U.S. Patent Office, which was a large facility and which served as a hospital pretty much through the war, they needed more than that. These buildings really had not obviously been built for surgery or convalescence, and so they needed to build new hospitals. Well, both the North and the South independently decided on a particular design of hospital. They're called pavilion hospitals. And these designs had been effective in France and in England. You can see they're long, narrow buildings, wooden usually, but they allowed greater ventilation. They let personnel and supplies move through them more quickly. It was a very effective design. And you can see that with these long, narrow buildings were usually set up in kind of beautiful geometric patterns. This one was in Baltimore, and this is Maurer Hospital in Philadelphia. Philadelphia had the two largest military hospitals in the North, Maurer, which was in Chestnut Hill, and Satterlee, which was in West Philadelphia. So things definitely improved with the pavilion hospitals. Now, these two big Philadelphia hospitals had about 3,000 beds apiece, but really the King Hospital was in Virginia, Chimborazo, which had 8,000 beds. I mean, it gives you an idea about the hordes of wounded who were being delivered into these places. Chimborazo, by the way, I always wondered about the name. It's named after an Ecuadorian volcano. And someone who owned land near outside of Richmond, where this hospital was built, the hospital reminded him of his trip to Ecuador and that volcano. And that is where we get Chimborazo. It also is unusual in that it had a woman administrator, Phoebe Penber. She and Sally Tompkins were pretty much the only ladies at the heads of hospitals. But who were the doctors? Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, the Union had fewer than 90 doctors in the Army, and the Confederate Army had fewer than 25. They came from all over. Some of them were seasoned soldiers, veterans who volunteered. Some of them were dentists who were commissioned in as surgeons. It was a huge variety of people, medical students, medical cadets who served as surgeons. And by the end of the war, there were 12,000 doctors in the Union Army and more than 3,000 in the Confederate Army. This photograph, I think, says an awful lot about conditions. When you look at it and you think about organization and cleanliness, sanitation, the paucity of the supplies that they had was as impressive as the fact that anybody survived it at all. Now, a question I frequently am asked is if North or South had better medical care. My impression is that it really was equal because of a couple reasons, in that most of the doctors, North and South, had trained in Philadelphia. They went to the University of Pennsylvania Medical College, which had opened 100 years before, actually, and to Jefferson Medical College. They were having the same classes and the same books, really. There was one medical school at the University of Virginia in the South that stayed open through the Civil War, but all the others really closed. They had very similar education. And also, now you may recognize this picture. It's a portion of the Thomas Eakins painting, The Gross Clinic, which resides, it's huge. It takes up an entire wall, and it is held at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Dr. Gross came from central Pennsylvania. He was Pennsylvania Dutch, and he didn't learn to speak English until he was a teenager. But he was a brilliant man. He became a physician, a surgeon, an author, and a teacher. And when the war started, he published a book for the young surgeons who were flocking into the army. And this book, I mean, they describe literally holding the book and operating. And it was used by the Confederate Army as well, because copies of it found their way into the South and were reprinted. Now, the Confederates did produce some books by Dr. Chisholm and some other prominent doctors to aid their surgeons, because at the time of the Civil War, it is estimated that maybe as many as 300 doctors in all of America had ever witnessed surgery or seen a gunshot wound. But some of these doctors, in terms of revolutionary changes in America, were pretty prominent. And this is one of my favorites. This is Dr. Alexander Thomas Augusta. Now, he was born in the state of Virginia. He was freeborn to parents of color. And since he was a child, he really wanted to be a doctor. But Virginia had extremely strict literacy laws, or we might say anti-literacy laws, that people of color could not learn to read and write under strict penalty, and penalties for anyone who would teach them. When he was a young man, Alexander Augusta made his way to Baltimore, Maryland, where things were a little looser. He worked as a barber, and he found people to kind of surreptitiously teach him to read and write. Well, he turned out to be a brilliant student. So he picked it right up, and it served him well throughout his life. Well, once he was fully literate, he applied to American medical schools, including University of Pennsylvania. All of them turned him down owing to the color of his skin. So he and his wife moved to Toronto, Canada, where he was accepted into medical school. It was a completely different situation there in terms of acceptance and respect for African Americans. He opened a pharmacy to support himself and his wife and to pay for his medical education. So he spent 6 years in medical school there. When he graduated, the dean called him a brilliant student. When he graduated, he went into private practice, and then he was tapped to become the head of the Toronto City Hospital. So you know this dude was pretty serious. When the Civil War began, Dr. Augusta wrote a letter to President Abraham Lincoln and volunteered his services to treat the African American soldiers, who were by now becoming quite large numbers in the Union Army. Well, that was months of back and forth. Yes, come. No, don't. Yes, do. But after months, he finally was commissioned into the Army as a major. When he retired, it was as a brevet lieutenant colonel. But Dr. Augusta had such revolutionary response to his simple existence in the Union Army. He effected a lot of changes, and one that I found very interesting. He was in downtown Washington, D.C. He was wearing his Union Army uniform, and he was on a streetcar. Well, it was raining heavily, and he was inside the car and, obviously trying to stay dry. Well, the other people in the streetcar were physically pushing him out onto a platform very small, you can see in the back outside where he obviously was going to get wet. Again, owing to the color of his skin. Well, he was furious, and he wrote another letter to President Lincoln. And that letter found its way to a Republican senator, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. And Senator Sumner was really angry. And he went to Congress about it. And before the end of the war, they passed an act declaring segregation illegal on public transportation in the city of Washington, D.C. Augusta continued to make amazing breakthroughs. He became the first Black hospital head in America. He became the first member of a faculty of a medical school belonging to a university, Howard University. And when he died, he was the first Black officer to be interred in Arlington National Cemetery. While we're talking about education, there was another form of education that was unavailable in this country during the Civil War, and that was veterinary medicine. There was no training. Now, in Europe, they had had lots of experience over the centuries with animal plagues, cattle plagues, horses. In the mid-1700s, they opened a school of veterinary medicine in Lyon, France. Any veterinarians who were in America during the Civil War were Europeans. There was no training, and farriers, the people who shod horses, were regarded as the experts in their health. But it wasn't until quite a few years after the Civil War that veterinary medical training was available in the United States. Well, what about nurses? This is another story. In the 1860s, American women were considered to be models of domestic sentimentality. They were supposed to be prim and polite and kind of in second place. And they were not welcomed or permitted, really, in most fields to work. The only jobs available for women at that point were teaching, and nursing was definitely out of the question. It was regarded to be in very poor taste for a woman to minister to any man outside of her immediate intimate family. And there was no nursing training. Nursing was traditionally done in the armies by men who were unable to fight for physical reasons, psychological reasons. Zero training, just kind of, you can't fight, so assist. Well, it was different in Europe because Florence Nightingale in England, who had been given a wonderful education, and she was a brilliant woman. She was an astonishing data analyst, and she just had tremendous foresight, and she had a lot of theories about healthcare. Well, when the war in Crimea came about, it was Florence's moment. She volunteered, she went to Crimea, and what passed as a hospital was a building with no administration, no organization, filthy, no beds. She went to work. She rounded up some other women. They cleaned it. They got the patients off the floor. They threw the windows open and got it ventilated. And again, they provided food and medicine on a schedule. That death rate plummeted like the ball in Times Square on New Year's Eve. It was astonishing. Well, when she went back to England, she then started training other women to be skilled nurses, and she started a school. But that really had not moved to America. Fortunately, a handful of women who worked with Florence Nightingale in England and Crimea did emigrate. So there were a few spots of a few people here and there who shared what they knew. The only groups of women in America with any training or experience in healthcare through their religious association were Catholic nuns. Well, this presented a whole new problem, really, because the 1840s and throughout, America had a huge anti-Catholic movement. Catholics were hated, and there was a group, an anti-immigration group called the Nativists. or commonly known as the Know-Nothings. And in 1844, they burned churches, Catholic churches in Philadelphia. This is St. Michael's in the Kensington area. It stands today. Mobs of the nativists burned this. They went after Old St. Joseph's. They were stopped by Quakers, but St. Augustine's, they took all the books out of the library, made a giant bonfire in the street. So nuns were really afraid to go outside of their convents wearing their habits for being attacked or harassed. It was an extremely negative atmosphere for them. Well, when you have hundreds of thousands of casualties and no nurses with training, who are you going to call? President Lincoln called the nuns, who had already begun to brave onto the battlefields and into the hospitals. And because they became beloved by the soldiers, because they were willing to treat Black, white, any age of men, they would treat people with known communicable diseases like smallpox, yellow fever. They were pretty fearless. They asked for very little for themselves, and they were willing to work crazy hours. It is estimated that 20% of all the nuns in the country served as nurses in the Civil War. So it's somewhere between 600 and 800 women who qualified. But a very interesting thing happened with these hated women and their hated habits, who became really saviors of these masses of wounded men. And it's reflected in the art of the period. This is an illustration from Frank Leslie's Illustrated or Harper's Weekly, one of the weekly publications. And here you see in the lower left a nun depicted in an angelic sense as a healer. So they really became beloved and seen as, saving angels. It was so strong that in the last century, Congress approved the erection of a monument to the nuns who served in the Civil War. And it is at the Cathedral of St. Matthew. It's a huge thing. It's actually four-sided. It was designed by an Irish sculptor, and it acknowledged their sacrifices during the Civil War. Something else that they didn't have in the Civil War were ambulances. I always tell people, in 1860, if you got run over by a horse and wagon on the main street in your city or town, you hoped somebody got word to your family to come scrape you up. And if they did, you hoped there was somebody in your family who could stay and nurse you, because there really were no provisions for that in this country. So what they would do after a battle, they had supply wagons coming in from before to after. They would take the supplies out. Frequently, they lost huge numbers of supplies because they dumped them out of the wagons, and then they would use the wagons, load in all these broken bodies, and get them to some kind of a facility that could treat them in a nearby city or town. Major Jonathan Letterman, who was a veteran soldier in the Union Army and a surgeon, and he was appalled by these situations and all these wounded lying on battlefields for days. So he went to the federal government and he got permission to establish an ambulance corps for the Union Army. So for the first time, they had dedicated vehicles. And again, this happened so fast within a couple of years. So they had quite a few different designs for ambulances, but they trained stretcher carriers to move on the same foot. And these vehicles were just for the transport of the wounded. Congress published an act to create that ambulance corps. And within this short period of time, you got ambulance trains like this. Now they're lined up before a battle, waiting for the casualties to pile up, and they're waiting to transport them to safety and to treatment. There's something I want to show you, because I frequently have to remind myself, this is not ancient Egypt. This is 160 years ago. It is 4 generations ago. Here is the inside of an ambulance today. From that rickety wooden wagon, here we are. Well, another new admission to the stage were hospital ships. This one is the USS Red Rover, which was actually a captured Confederate vessel, and a pretty new one. It was less than a year old since the Confederate Army had had it built. When the Union captured it, they refitted it as a hospital ship. And in another breaking of tradition, there were 2 nuns who were invited to serve on the ship, and 5 women who were considered contraband. They were escaped slaves. And this ship went on the Mississippi River with those 7 women who talked and wrote later about it was so hot and there were bugs. And this is way before air conditioning. And they talked about having to wash bandages, and you could never get them clean. You could never get them dry. It was a pretty grim situation. But hospital ships held on. And I mean, today, these are vessels that bring medical care to remote coastal areas. It's been an incredible innovation. So we also get, for the first time, trains used as hospital trains. Now, there was a real discrepancy with the North and South, because the North had pretty straightforward track situations. But the South, there were many different companies that were involved in the trains. So the tracks were of different gauges. I thought if you played with trains as a kid, it would be like going from Lionel to the smaller tracks. And so you couldn't get a straight through journey necessarily in the South. But the North did better with the trains. The North also painted the engines red. And it seems to be a fact that the South never attacked a hospital train. So what they did was send supplies to the battlefields in boxcars, and then they brought them back crammed with wounded soldiers. There was a physician, Dr. Alicia Harris, who, again, I mean, it was a hideous situation with these guys crammed in where you couldn't even lie down. They didn't build special cars, but they refitted them. So they refitted them with bunks, and they had India rubber rings so that you could bring a soldier in on a stretcher. And instead of moving him and causing him more pain, you could suspend the stretcher from these rubber rings. So it was a smoother ride than those terrible wagons. There were a lot of other innovations that occurred, including the common use of anesthesia for surgery. And Dr. John Julian Chisholm, who was very well known, a brilliant guy, compassionate and empathic, they had a problem in the South, the naval blockade preventing them from bringing in more pharmaceuticals, more anesthesia, and their supplies were running low. Well, the traditional method of using anesthesia was they would soak a cloth with ether or chloroform and place it over the mouth of the patient until the patient became unconscious. So it was kind of an iffy operation. Well, Dr. Chisholm invented something we know as the Chisholm inhaler. This is way blown up. This little thing really is about 3, maybe 4 inches long. These 2 straw-like things at the end. They went into the patient's nostrils, and then this little area where you see the screen, they would either drip ether or chloroform into that, or they would use a cloth soaked with that and put it in that. It was a much more efficient way to get that medication into the patient, and it also really kind of saved the South's supplies. It used so much less than the old method of soaking a cloth. Well, we get a lot of things in this revolution, this tsunami of a revolution that was Civil War medicine. And one of them of great value, was the Geneva Convention, the original Geneva Convention of 1864. I was surprised by how many of the original accounts that I read of not just doctors, but generals. There was a very strong feeling among both armies that there should be some kind of a law that rendered the wounded and their caretakers neutral. And it was one of the tenets of the original Geneva Convention that made those non-combatants as neutral parties. You could not fire on them, capture them. It was a revolutionary humanitarian gesture. Now, the Red Cross came about because of the Civil War. Now, it actually was not official in the United States until 1881. But Clara Barton, I have to mention her. We all know her name, but there are so many things that this woman was involved with that were extraordinary. She considered herself a relief worker. She did not like to be called a nurse, but she took it on herself to bring supplies into battlefields. She raised the money for the supplies. She brought them in ahead of the battles. She risked her life multiple times. But after the war, a lot of things happened towards the end of the war and right after it that were pretty intense. And one of the things that she did after the truce was signed, she opened an office for missing soldiers. Clara Barton answered more than 60,000 letters about missing husbands, brothers, sons, and she found about 22,000 of them and was able to bring families some level of relief. And she also cared a lot about the people who had been prisoners. So she got involved with Andersonville, the legendary, hideous prison in Georgia. And she met someone who had been in prison there as a teenager, Dorrance Atwater, who had kept a secret record of people he knew who had died there. So they were able to identify not all, but a large percentage of the people who died in Andersonville, and she was instrumental in Andersonville Cemetery becoming a national site of the Civil War. There was a memorial to the war horses. It's a little hard to read. I'll read you this. This was established in 1997 in Richmond, Virginia, in memory of the 1.5 million horses and mules of the Union and the Confederate armies who were killed, were wounded, or died from their wounds in the Civil War. So that's a lot of animals. And this particular statue is in Philadelphia. It's in a remote part. Now, I read that you guys have been very instrumental in trying to have this moved to a more prominent place in Philadelphia. It's near Memorial Hall in Fairmount Park, and I understand that there's been a very long time movement to have it brought to the Parkway in Philadelphia. The equestrian statues are a particular favorite of mine. They're so beautiful. And again, Old Baldy to me represents, and I guess to you, these millions of loyal animals who were lost in this conflict. After the war ended, the government originally allowed the scavenging of horse remains and the selling of the bones. And Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, he contacted the quartermaster asking that farmers be granted the right to dig up the bones of fallen military horses and use them as fertilizer for crops. Well, the quartermaster refused that request. He stated that they were animals who had died in service to their country, and consequently their remains deserved honor. And in an 1865 letter from the quartermaster's office, there was the statement, having died in service, he thinks they, the horses, ought to rest in peace. Thank you very much for inviting me to share this information with you, and I will love to answer any questions that you might have.